The mansion stood in silence, its marble halls echoing with nothing but absence. Once filled with laughter, music, and the warmth of a family, it had become a place where shadows lingered far longer than the sunlight ever dared. In that heavy stillness lived two little boys, Liam and Caleb twins, who had never heard a single note of sound since the day they were born. Their mother, Grace, had taken her last breath the same day they took their first, and their father, Alexander Hayes, a man of staggering fortune and influence, had never fully returned from that loss. For years the Hayes estate had been frozen, like a beautiful painting draped in dust. Liam and Caleb existed in its corridors like ghosts, too young to understand what they had lost, but old enough to feel the absence that pressed in on every side. They did not laugh. They did not cry the way other children did. They wandered in silence, eyes lowered, expressions unreadable, as though locked away behind an invisible wall. Alexander himself had retreated into a rhythm of shadows. A powerful businessman by reputation, in his own home he was only a figure who moved from office to bedroom, from study to meeting, his voice clipped and precise whenever he bothered to use it at all. To him the silence felt inevitable, an inheritance of tragedy that no therapy, no wealth, and no outside expert had been able to touch. And then Sophia Miller arrived. She wasn't famous. She wasn't armed with degrees or celebrated achievements. She had come to the mansion simply as a housekeeper, an ordinary woman with a quiet warmth that radiated from her in ways Alexander couldn't yet understand. She had no plans to become anything more than helpful hands in the household. Yet, within weeks of her arrival, the stillness of the mansion began to stir. It happened one unremarkable afternoon, in the wide kitchen where the twins sat at a small table, staring blankly at the plates before them. Sophia, tired of the suffocating quiet, reached into her bag and pulled out a little speaker she carried everywhere. Without hesitation, she pressed play. A soulful melody filled the space, not loudly, but enough to ripple through the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. She had no expectation, perhaps even anticipated rejection. But what followed was something close to a miracle. Liam looked up, his brows furrowing as if puzzling out a secret. Caleb blinked rapidly, his little foot tapping against the chair leg. The vibrations hummed in their small bodies, and then, fragile, almost accidental, a giggle slipped out. Sophia's heart leapt. Without pausing, she placed the speaker on the counter and let her body sway with the rhythm. Her movements were exaggerated, playful, almost silly. "Come on, little explorers," she teased. Though her words were not what mattered, the joy in her expression carried the meaning. Caleb slid clumsily from his chair, wobbling on unsteady knees, his eyes alive with something Sophia had never seen in him before. Liam followed, reluctant not to be left behind. Their first steps were awkward, their motions uncertain, but for the first time since she had met them, they were moving with life in their eyes. The kitchen transformed into something sacred. Laughter, thin, imperfect, but unmistakable, bounced off the walls. Liam clapped his small hands. Caleb stomped his feet, and Sophia bent low to guide them, holding one hand in each of hers as they swayed together in a rhythm only they could feel. What years of therapy and clinical effort could not reach, music and kindness unlocked in a single afternoon. It was in the middle of that small miracle that Alexander walked in. He had come only to retrieve a file he had left behind, his mind brimming with figures and deadlines. But the sight that met him in the doorway rooted him where he stood. The folder slipped from his hand and scattered papers across the floor, unnoticed. His silent, unreachable sons were dancing. They were laughing, faces flushed with a joy he had believed lost forever. Caleb's head was thrown back. Liam clutched Sophia's arm for balance, and those sounds pierced through Alexander like lightning to his chest. For the first time in years, his sons were alive before his eyes. And it wasn't him who had brought them there. It was her. Alexander Hayes stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, unable to process what he was seeing. For years his sons had been distant shadows, unreachable despite every specialist he had paid, every program he had tried. And now, in a moment that seemed to defy explanation, they were moving with abandon, clapping, laughing, their faces alight with joy. The sound of their laughter struck him with a force so sharp his chest tightened painfully. He had almost forgotten what that sound felt like. Since Grace's death, his memories of laughter had been muted, dulled by grief, until he had convinced himself they would never return. Yet here it was raw, real, echoing through the kitchen where silence had once ruled like a tyrant. Sophia Miller twirled again, her braids catching the air as she bent low to meet the boys at their level. Caleb clung to her fingers, his eyes glowing with pride at every small movement he managed to mimic. Liam tugged impatiently at her sleeve, unwilling to be left out of even a second of her attention. Together, the three of them spun a fragile rhythm into being, a rhythm stronger than the walls grief had built around the Hayes family. Alexander's throat burned. He hadn't realized his hand had lifted to press against his chest until he felt the ache there, sharp and unfamiliar. The scene blurred before him as his eyes stung, though no tears fell. He wanted to step forward, to demand an explanation, to know how she had achieved what the best doctors could not. Yet his feet refused to move. All he could do was watch, rooted by awe and disbelief. When Sophia finally caught sight of him in the doorway, she stilled only for a second. Her expression calm but guarded. She didn't try to explain. She simply smiled at the boys and clapped along with them, as if daring Alexander to see what was right before his eyes. That night, long after the children had been tucked into bed, and the mansion returned to its usual hush, Alexander lay awake. His body was restless, though he had barely moved all day. His mind replayed the kitchen scene over and over, Caleb's laughter, Liam's clumsy stomps, the way Sophia's presence had ignited something no amount of therapy had. It should have filled him with gratitude, but instead it left him unsettled. For years, he had accepted the specialist's verdicts. His sons would always be isolated, their connection to the world fragile, uncertain. And now, with nothing more than music and a woman's warmth, they had shattered that belief. The next morning, Alexander found Sophia in the kitchen, humming softly while preparing breakfast. Liam and Caleb sat at the table, their small hands busy with wooden blocks they usually ignored. But now, instead of listless stares, they tapped the blocks rhythmically, their eyes bright with focus. Alexander's throat closed at the sight. He should have been relieved. Instead, he grasped for control, for the sharpness that had always steadied him. His voice came out colder than he intended. "Miss Miller," he said, his tone cutting through the room, "what exactly do you think you're doing with my children?" Sophia set the knife she had been holding carefully on the counter and wiped her hands on a cloth before turning to face him fully. Her expression was steady, her eyes unflinching. "I was giving them joy," she said simply. "They deserve that." His jaw tightened. "They don't need tricks. They need structure. They need therapy, schedules, expert. What you did yesterday wasn't treatment. It was reckless." The words landed heavy in the air, like a verdict. But Sophia did not back down. Her voice was quiet, but her conviction cut sharper than any argument. "With respect, Mr. Hayes' joy isn't reckless. It's the only thing they've been starved of." Her words hit him harder than he expected, leaving him momentarily speechless. He opened his mouth to reassert his authority, but the memory of Caleb's laughter rose unbidden, robbing him of the certainty he clung to. "You're overstepping," he finally managed, though his voice lacked its usual steel. Sophia's tone softened, but her stance did not. "I'm not trying to replace the doctors. I'm not pretending I know everything they know. But I see your sons as more than a diagnosis. They're children. Children who crave connection. Yesterday, they let me in. That matters whether you want to admit it or not." Alexander swallowed hard, his fists tightening at his sides. Pride battled against longing, grief against possibility. He wanted to dismiss her words, to tell himself she was naive. Yet the image of Liam's tiny hands clapping to a beat, of Caleb spinning clumsily in her arms, refused to fade. It was the first time in years anyone had challenged him not with anger but with truth. And though he hated to admit it, her truth had shaken the walls he thought unbreakable. Later that morning, Alexander tried to bury himself in work. He locked himself inside his office, papers spread across the desk, numbers staring back at him like they might distract him from the chaos stirring in his chest. But no matter how hard he tried, his thoughts betrayed him. Every figure blurred into the image of Liam stomping his feet. Caleb throwing his head back in laughter, Sophia spinning between them with a smile radiant enough to pierce through years of darkness. He hated the vulnerability creeping into him, hated that someone else had managed, in one afternoon, what all his wealth and resources had failed to do for years. Beneath that resentment, though, something far more dangerous took root: longing. He wanted to hear those giggles again, to see the light in his son's eyes, and that terrified him. Hope was a cruel thing. Hope, if broken, could destroy him completely. By the time he left his office, the house felt different. Not silent in the way it used to be, but charged, as though laughter had left its echo behind. Drawn by something he couldn't resist, Alexander walked to the living room. There, Sophia sat cross-legged on the rug with Liam and Caleb at her sides. Wooden blocks were scattered in front of them, and she guided their small hands to stack one block carefully on top of another. Liam reached out and tugged at her sleeve, his eyes bright with expectation. Caleb leaned lazily against her shoulder, watching every move with rapt attention. The sight rooted Alexander to the doorway. For years his sons had resisted contact, even with each other. Now, here they were, leaning into her like she was a safe place they had always known. A sharp pang pierced his chest. Jealousy, or maybe shame, because it wasn't him they reached for. It wasn't him they trusted. He turned away quickly, swallowing the lump that burned in his throat. Yet the image stayed with him, branded into memory, undeniable proof that something in the house was changing. Over the next days, the routines of the Hayes mansion began to shift in ways Alexander could never have predicted. Sophia had a way of turning ordinary tasks into little adventures. Folding laundry wasn't just folding laundry. It became a puppet show where socks had voices and shirts transformed into superhero capes. At first, Liam and Caleb only watched with puzzled expressions. But slowly, almost shyly, their lips curved into smiles, their little fingers reaching to grab the puppets for themselves. Sweeping the floor turned into a race. Sophia would hold the broom like a baton and declare a competition, sending the boys into fits of clumsy laughter as they ran across the polished wood floors. Washing dishes became a game of bubbles, with Sophia blowing suds into the air until the kitchen shimmered with tiny floating lights. Caleb pointed with wide-eyed wonder. Liam clapped his hands together to catch and pop one, falling into helpless giggles when soap sprayed across his cheeks. From the hallway, Alexander often watched unseen, his arms folded tightly, trying to convince himself it was chaos, a necessary disruption in a house that had always thrived on order. But every time, his stern expression cracked. He saw his sons laughing, alive in ways he had never imagined, and something deep inside him stirred, uncomfortable but undeniable. Evenings grew harder for him. After the boys went to bed, he would retreat to his office, haunted by their voices, their signs, their smiles. Sophia had done what he could not, and though he tried to bury the truth beneath his pride, he could not escape it. The silence that had once been his fortress was now a prison. The twins had always been shadows of each other, close in the way siblings naturally were, but withdrawn, rarely reaching out. Now, under Sophia's patient guidance, that was changing. She didn't just draw them toward herself, she gently pushed them toward one another. Liam, give the block to Caleb. She would sign slowly, her hands moving with deliberate clarity. Liam hesitated, his little brows furrowed as though the request was a puzzle. But then he extended his arm, the block clutched in his small fingers. Caleb's face lit up as he accepted it, the motion clumsy but purposeful. And in return, Caleb passed it back, one exchange, then another. A rhythm forming, not of music this time but of trust. Alexander, watching from the staircase, felt his chest twist. He had always believed his sons would remain isolated, not only from the world but even from each other. Yet here they were, learning to share, to smile at one another, to speak in their own broken way without sound, and none of it had come from him. The realization cut deep. Pride in their progress mixed with guilt at grace. His wife, their mother, should have been the one to see this, not him. He remembered her teasing voice in their early days of marriage, telling him their children would one day be loud, mischievous, unstoppable. Now, standing above the scene, Alexander felt the wound of her absence reopen. She would never see their first attempts at words, their first shared laughter, The ache of that truth nearly crushed him. One evening, long after the boys had been tucked in, Sophia lingered in the living room, tidying toys scattered across the carpet. As she reached beneath a cabinet for a ball, her eyes caught a dusty silver frame tucked away on a high shelf. She pulled it down, wiped the glass with her sleeve, and froze. Inside was a photograph of a younger Alexander, smiling in a way she had never seen, his hand entwined with a woman whose eyes radiated warmth. Though Sophia had never met her, she felt as though she knew her already, through the silence that hung in the house, through the heaviness in Alexander's eyes. For a long moment she studied the picture, touched by the tenderness captured in its stillness. Quietly, she placed it not back on the hidden shelf, but lower, where little eyes could see. Something inside her insisted the twins deserved to know this face. Not just the absence, but the love that had once lived here. The next morning, Liam wandered through the room and stopped in his tracks. His head tilted, his eyes locked on the photograph. Slowly, he reached out a finger and tapped the glass. Caleb toddled closer, curious, and together they stood before the frame, their small shoulders brushing. Then, with visible effort, Liam raised his hands and shaped a clumsy sign. Mama. Sophia's chest constricted. Tears burned her eyes, but she swallowed them back. She crouched beside them, her voice tender though she knew they could barely hear. Yes, sweetheart, that's your mama. Caleb fumbled to mimic his brother's gesture, his movements messy, but the intent clear. Both boys stared at the photo as if some hidden part of them recognized her. Sophia rested a gentle hand on each of their backs. She was beautiful, wasn't she? Moments later, Alexander entered the room. The sight froze him. His son stood before the photograph he had buried away, their little hands lifted in the sign for a word he had refused to speak aloud in years. Mama. His breath caught, his throat burning. He had hidden Grace's memory, convinced silence was the only way to protect the children from grief. Yet here they were, claiming her with their tiny fingers, reopening a wound he thought sealed forever. What are you doing? His voice cracked, harsher than he intended. Sophia turned, her expression calm, though her eyes held understanding. They found her picture, she said softly. They knew before I said a word. Alexander's hands curled into fists, anger rising not at her, but at the helplessness unraveling inside him. They don't understand, he snapped. They don't need to. But his sons turned at the sound of his voice, and Liam lifted his hands again. Mama. The word he had feared most broke him wide open. For the first time since Grace's funeral, Alexander felt tears threaten. He crouched to his knees, trembling, his voice a raw whisper. Yes, that's Mama. And in that moment, the silence that had ruled the house cracked, not shattered, but cracked enough to let grief and love spill through together. The photograph remained on the lower shelf after that morning, and though Alexander never admitted it aloud, he didn't move it back. Every time he walked past and caught Liam or Caleb staring at their mother's face, his chest tightened with a complicated blend of pain and relief. They were beginning to know her, not through memory, but through the love that still lived in the house. Sophia noticed the shift as well. The twins no longer avoided the picture. Instead, they often pointed toward it, making their imperfect signs, sometimes smiling, sometimes quiet and contemplative. For them, Grace was no longer just an absence. She was a presence stitched into their story. One rainy afternoon, Sophia gathered her courage to reveal something she had kept private. She had been sitting on the living room floor with a notebook open, its pages covered in scribbles and diagrams of hands. The twins watched curiously as she repeated movements, fumbling through signs, her lips silently shaping words. When Alexander walked in, his brow furrowed. What is this? His voice carried suspicion, though beneath it was genuine confusion. Sophia looked up, her expression steady though tinged with nerves. I've been learning something for them, she explained softly. Turning toward the boys, she lifted her hands and shaped a simple word. Play. Liam's eyes widened instantly. Caleb leaned forward, his brows furrowing in concentration. They had seen therapists use signs before, but never like this. Never with the warmth and patience Sophia carried. Alexander took a slow step into the room, his voice low. What are you doing? Instead of answering him, Sophia signed another word, slower this time. Happy. She pressed her hand gently against her chest, repeating the gesture. Her lips formed the word, her eyes radiating encouragement. The twins tried to mimic her. Their fingers fumbled, their movements messy, but the effort was undeniable. Sophia clapped her hands softly. That's right. Yes, Liam. Yes, Caleb, that's happy. A faint giggle escaped Liam. Caleb's lips moved as though trying to echo the sound of the word. Alexander's chest tightened. He had paid countless experts, listened to endless evaluations, and been told progress would come only through years of structure and therapy. Yet here was Sophia with no credentials, bridging the silence with nothing but persistence and love. Then she introduced another sign. Love. She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes soft. Love, she whispered as if giving them a gift. Caleb copied first, clumsily pressing his arms to his chest. His little face broke into a grin when Sophia nodded in approval. Liam hesitated, biting his lip before attempting it, his arms awkward but determined. When he succeeded, he laughed aloud, small but unmistakable. Sophia's voice trembled. That's beautiful. She glanced at Alexander, their eyes meeting for a heartbeat. He saw no pride, no need for recognition, only devotion. She had stayed up night after night memorizing these signs, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Shame burned through him. In all these years, he had never learned to speak to his children in their language. He had built walls of wealth, of order, of silence, but never taken the simplest step of reaching across. For the first time in years, Alexander moved closer, drawn as if by an invisible thread. He sat on the edge of the rug across from them. Both boys lit up instantly at his presence. Liam tugged at his sleeve, babbling incoherently but with intent. Caleb reached for his father's hand, urging him to join. Alexander's hands felt heavy, clumsy. He had watched the signs, but his body resisted. Sophia's eyes met his, calm, insistent. Try, she whispered. Just one word. Just one word. He swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling too quickly. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he shaped the sign he had just seen. His lips parted, his voice barely a whisper. Papa. The reaction was immediate. Liam gasped, his little hands clapping his chest before signing back, eyes wide with wonder. Caleb laughed, jerky but enthusiastic as he mimicked the gesture. Both turned toward him with joy so pure it nearly undid him. Papa, Liam murmured, broken but audible. Caleb hugged his father's arm, small body warm against him. Alexander's heart cracked wide open. For the first time in years, he wasn't just watching from the sidelines. He was part of their world. Hope had begun to stir inside Alexander, fragile as a flame on a windy night. Every clumsy sign from the boys, every laugh, every tiny attempt to speak filled him with awe and terror. He wanted to believe they were making progress, real progress, but a lifetime of discipline and caution held him back. His mind screamed for proof. So when Dr. Harold Stein, the pediatric neurologist who had followed the twins since birth, scheduled a progress check, Alexander clung to it like an anchor. At last, he thought, there would be validation, confirmation that what he was witnessing wasn't just illusion. The morning of the visit, he paced the living room restless. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched. Sophia moved quietly through the house, sensing his tension. She tried to reassure him. They'll show him who they are, she said gently. Alexander cut her off. We'll see. His tone was clipped, betraying the storm inside. When Dr. Stein arrived, his presence filled the room with authority. He was calm, clinical, detached, the way he had always been. Adjusting his glasses, he greeted the boys with polite nods, scribbling notes on his pad. Alexander crouched beside Liam and Caleb, urging them forward, his voice almost pleading. Go on, show Papa, show Dr. Stein. At first, Liam lifted his hands, forming a familiar sign. Alexander's heart leapt, but then the boy noticed the doctor's gaze, cold and evaluating, and froze. Caleb shrank back, pressing himself against Sophia's side, his body rigid with discomfort. It's okay, Alexander urged, too forcefully this time. Do it again, show him. But the boys clung tighter to Sophia. Silence pressed in, suffocating. Dr. Stein cleared his throat softly. Mr. Hayes, he said, his tone patient but firm. Children often mimic gestures in moments of play. It doesn't necessarily indicate meaningful progress. Alexander's pulse roared in his ears. They're communicating, he insisted. They're using signs. They're laughing, engaging, things they've never done before. The doctor sighed, jotting another note. Encouraging, yes, but anecdotal. We can't equate emotional responses with developmental breakthroughs. False hope can be damaging, for you and for them. Each word landed like a hammer. Under the scrutiny of science, the miracle he had clung to shriveled. The boys retreated into silence, and Alexander felt humiliated, exposed. Desperation twisted into anger, and that anger needed somewhere to go. His gaze snapped to Sophia. "This is your doing," he snapped. His voice sharp as a blade. Her head lifted, eyes widening. "Mine," she asked, calm but firm. "You filled their heads with illusions, parlor tricks. You make them laugh. You get them to mimic you, and suddenly you convince me they're changing. But when it matters, when it counts, they collapse back into silence. Do you realize what you've done? You've given me false hope." His voice cracked with venom, but it was his own self-loathing spilling out. Sophia rose slowly, gathering the boys against her. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady but carried conviction. "Hope is not an illusion. It's the only thing that's kept them alive in this silence." She tapped her chest, then gestured to the twins. "You think charts and reports will raise them? That statistics will teach them to trust, to laugh, to look you in the eye? No, Alexander, what they need is someone who believes in them. What they need is faith." Her words pierced deeper than any clinical assessment ever could, but Alexander's pride would not let him yield. His silence turned heavy, the gulf between them widening. The rest of the day passed under a suffocating cloud. Sophia moved quietly through the mansion, her laughter gone, her gestures measured. The twins clung to her more tightly, sensing the storm they could not name. And Alexander buried himself in work, replaying the confrontation again and again, unable to silence the truth beneath her word. The days that followed stretched heavy and cold, like a fog that refused to lift. The mansion, once beginning to bloom with life again, fell into a silence sharper than before. Sophia still cared for Liam and Caleb with tenderness, but the spark was gone. Her laughter no longer filled the hallways. Her games no longer carried the same energy. She moved carefully, her voice even, as though any misstep might reopen the wound left by Alexander's accusations. The twins felt it most of all. They clung to her with quiet desperation, their wide eyes flicking between her and their father whenever he entered the room. They still played, but their giggles were subdued, muffled, as though even joy now felt dangerous. Alexander hated himself for it. Each evening, alone in his study, he replayed the confrontation in his mind. He told himself he had only spoken the truth, that illusions would destroy them all. But deep down, he knew the truth he feared most. He had lashed out not because Sophia was wrong, but because she had been right. One evening, as rain streaked against the tall windows, the atmosphere shifted again. Dinner had ended, and Sophia was quietly clearing the dishes while the twins sat nearby, restless. Liam spotted her bag on a chair, half open, with a small speaker peeking out, his eyes lit with recognition. Without hesitation, he slid off his chair, tugged the device free, and set it proudly on the kitchen floor. Caleb followed, curious. With deliberate care, Liam pressed the familiar button. Music spilled out, clumsy, a little distorted, but enough. Caleb squealed, stomping his feet to the beat. Liam clapped along, his little face glowing. Then, as though remembering, both boys turned to Sophia, eyes wide, bodies bouncing in an invitation she could not ignore. For a moment she hesitated. Alexander's harsh words still echoed in her chest. What if he saw again? What if she made things worse? But then Liam's small hands clapped insistently, and Caleb echoed him with a laugh that rang like a bell. Her hesitation melted. With a deep breath, Sophia stepped into their circle. She bent low, exaggerating her steps as she spun once, then stomped her feet in rhythm. Instantly, laughter poured out of the boys, bubbling like a spring that had been waiting to burst. Again, her expression said, though no words were needed. She twirled once more, and Caleb toppled over in his attempt to mimic her, laughing so hard he couldn't catch his breath. Liam clapped wildly, his little hands red from the effort. The room transformed. The cold distance of the past days softened, replaced with warmth and movement. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Upstairs, Alexander sat in his office, telling himself not to interfere. He had resolved to leave the evening untouched. But then he heard it. Faint at first, then clearer, the unmistakable sound of laughter. Real laughter echoing through the house. His chest tightened. Against his better judgment, he rose and followed the sound. At the kitchen doorway, he froze. Liam and Caleb were dancing, stomping, their eyes shining as Sophia spun in their midst like a beacon of joy. For a moment, guilt stabbed through him. He had nearly destroyed this, and yet it was still here. Then something happened that shook him to his core. Both boys turned toward him, their little hands rising in unsteady gestures, clumsy but clear. Dance, Papa? Alexander's heart lurched. Never before had they invited him like this. Their eyes, wide with hope, locked on him, waiting. Panic gripped him. What if he couldn't? What if he looked foolish? But their hands signed again. Dance, Papa. Sophia turned to him too, her expression soft, urging him forward without a word. His knees felt weak, but for the first time, Alexander let go of the walls he had built. He stepped into the room, raised his arms awkwardly, and swayed in rhythm with them. The boys squealed with delight, stomping harder, their laughter filling every corner. Alexander crouched low, spinning clumsily with them, and for once, he wasn't the billionaire or the widower defined by grief. He was simply Papa that night. Sleep refused to come. Alexander sat in his study, the echoes of laughter still alive in his chest. He had danced. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but with his sons, and they had welcomed him. The memory should have soothed him, yet something inside remained unsettled, unfinished. Long past midnight, he found himself standing before the old desk he had avoided for years. With trembling fingers, he opened a drawer he hadn't touched since Grace's death. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed but never sent. He knew its contents by heart. It was the letter he had written to Grace, 2 weeks after she passed, a desperate confession of his fear that he would never be enough for their sons. For a long time he simply held it, the weight of those words pressing against his palm. Then, almost against his will, he left the study and walked down the hall toward Sophia's room. He hesitated at her door, breath shallow before knocking. Moments later, she opened it, dressed simply, her eyes widening at the sight of him, disheveled, exhausted, holding a letter like it was both a weapon and a plea. "I wrote this," he said hoarsely, "for Grace. I never sent it." Sophia said nothing, only stepped aside, granting him space. He handed her the envelope. She sat on the edge of her bed, carefully opening it, her eyes scanning each line slowly. Alexander stood stiffly, unable to watch, yet unwilling to leave. No one had ever read those words, not his parents, not his colleagues, not even his closest friends. It was the only time he had laid bare his terror, that he could never be the father his sons needed, that they might grow up strangers to him, that Grace's absence had left a void he was powerless to fill. When Sophia finished, her hands trembled as she folded the paper gently. She held it between her palms like something sacred. Then she looked up, her voice soft but certain. "She would have been proud of you, Alexander." His throat constricted. He wanted to argue, to reject her kindness, but she continued. "Not because of the empire you built, not because of money. She would have been proud because you're still here, because you didn't walk away. You stayed, you tried, and you're still trying." His head lowered, her words breaking against the vulnerable place the letter had opened. She rose, stepping closer. With reverence, she placed the folded letter back into his hand. "You didn't give up on them, or on yourself." He clutched it tightly, afraid it might crumble if he let go. Then her hand rose, gently cupping the side of his face. Not romantic, not forward, simply human, tender. He leaned into it before he could stop himself, his eyes closing. "You were never supposed to be enough alone," she whispered. "No one is." For the first time in years, he let someone see the pain he had hidden so well. He spoke haltingly of the night he wrote the letter, of sitting outside the nursery door, while Caleb cried for hours and Liam refused to let him hold him. He confessed how close he had come to calling Grace's parents, begging them to take the boys, because he believed they'd be better off without him. Sophia listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her presence unshakable. When he faltered, afraid of her judgment, she only murmured, "I'm sorry you went through that alone." No one had ever said those words to him, not once, and in that moment, Something inside him loosened. By the time he left her room, the hour impossibly late, the letter back in his hand no longer felt like a wound. It was a reminder, a mark of survival. He returned to his study and placed it back in the drawer, not hidden this time, but preserved. The silence around him no longer suffocating, but full of something new. The following weeks brought changes Alexander couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried to maintain his walls. The house, once suffocating in its stillness, grew alive with patterns of laughter, music, and small but steady victories. Sophia had a way of weaving joy into every corner of the day. When the twins resisted mealtime, she turned broccoli into tiny trees, arranging forests on their plates until Caleb giggled and pretended to chop them down. When Liam grew frustrated with puzzles, she knelt beside him, guiding his little hands with patience until his furrowed brows melted into triumph. And always she wove signs into everything. At first, Alexander had resisted, lingering at the edges of the room with his arms folded, convinced it was a distraction. But each time Liam signed more with clumsy precision, or Caleb shaped thank you after receiving his favorite toy, something inside him stirred. The words were simple, but they were words. Real communication, forming piece by piece. One evening, while clearing paperwork from his desk, Alexander paused at the sound of muffled giggles from the hallway. He followed it quietly and stopped outside the playroom. The door was ajar, and through it he saw Sophia kneeling on the floor, both boys draped across her lap in fits of laughter. She was tickling them mercilessly, her face radiant, her own laughter joining theirs. It wasn't just that the twins were happy, it was that they were safe with her, in a way Alexander had never been able to provide. He leaned against the doorway, unseen, torn between admiration and envy. For years he had convinced himself love was not enough, that only order, structure, and discipline could keep his sons afloat. Yet here they were, thriving not through rules but through tenderness. When Sophia finally glanced up and noticed him, her smile faltered just slightly, as if bracing for reprimand. But Alexander said nothing. He only met her eyes, and for the first time, he let the smallest smile touch his lips before walking away. That night, as he tucked the boys into bed, something unexpected happened. Caleb, who usually wriggled away when Alexander leaned close, reached up with small hands and touched his father's cheek. Then, slowly, carefully, he crossed his arms over his chest. Love. The gesture was imperfect, crooked, but it sent a shiver through Alexander's body. His throat closed. He swallowed hard, lowering himself to his knees. Liam, not wanting to be left out, signed it too sloppy, rushed, but unmistakable. Alexander's vision blurred. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I love you too." His hands, trembling, mirrored the sign. Both boys squealed, giggling into their pillows. And for the first time, Alexander kissed their foreheads without hesitation. Later, alone in his study, he sat with his head in his hands, the memory replaying like a sacred echo. He had waited years for that moment, years of silence, doubt, and despair, and it had finally come, not because of him, but because Sophia had given them the bridge they needed. And for the first time, Alexander admitted to himself the truth he had been resisting. He needed her, too. The shift inside the mansion was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. Where once the walls had absorbed only silence, now they carried echoes of play, fragments of signs, and bursts of laughter that seemed to linger long after the sound itself was gone. But with change came unease. Alexander was not a man accustomed to vulnerability. Each time he allowed himself to smile, to join a game, to sign back to his sons, a voice inside whispered warnings. What if it doesn't last? What if this joy is stolen again? He carried that fear into every interaction, even as he found himself drawn more deeply into his children's lives. He began setting work aside earlier, joining them at dinner instead of burying himself in contracts. He lingered by their bedsides at night, watching the slow rise and fall of their chests, marveling at how much he had missed in his own home. One evening, after a particularly long day, he found Sophia and the twins in the library. The room, once cold and unused, now looked transformed. The heavy curtains had been drawn back, letting moonlight spill across the carpet. Sophia had built a small fort out of cushions and blankets, and the boys sat inside, their faces glowing with excitement. "What is this?" Alexander asked, his voice softer than usual. Caleb popped his head out from beneath the blanket flap, grinning, and clapped his hands in invitation. Liam gestured wildly, signing come with enthusiastic but crooked movements. Sophia smiled, her eyes meeting Alexander's. "We're explorers tonight. The library is a forest, and the fort is our camp." Alexander raised a brow, a skeptical smile tugging at his lips despite himself. "Explorers? Yes," Sophia said gently. "And every explorer needs a guide." There was a pause. The boys waited, their eyes wide, their tiny hands gesturing eagerly. And for once, Alexander didn't hesitate. He shrugged off his jacket, loosened his tie, and crouched low to crawl inside the fort. The boys erupted into laughter, tackling him clumsily as though he had just completed the greatest act of bravery. Alexander found himself laughing too, the sound rusty but genuine. For a moment, he was not the man haunted by loss. He was simply a father, crouched inside a blanket fort, his sons pressed close against him. Sophia sat at the edge, watching the scene unfold. The faint smile on her face carried something deeper than amusement. It carried quiet hope. Later, after the twins had finally collapsed in their beds, Alexander lingered by the library fire. Sophia entered to tidy the cushions, but he stopped her with a quiet word. "Leave it." She looked at him puzzled. "Leave the fort," he clarified. His voice softened. "They'll want it tomorrow." For a long moment their eyes held. The firelight flickered against her face, and Alexander felt that now familiar stirring in his chest. Gratitude, admiration, something dangerously close to longing. "You've changed this house," he said at last, his tone raw. Sophia lowered her gaze, her voice modest. "I only reminded it how to breathe." The words struck him harder than he expected. He wanted to say more, to tell her what he hadn't yet admitted even to himself, but the weight of vulnerability pressed against his throat, holding the words captive. So instead, he simply nodded, watching her move quietly around the room, the presence that had become the heartbeat of his home. The following weekend, Sophia suggested something Alexander hadn't considered in years, taking the twins outside the mansion for a proper outing. "Outside?" he repeated, brows raised. His tone held more caution than surprise. "Yes," Sophia replied calmly. "They've been cooped up too long. A park, maybe. Somewhere open where they can feel the grass, see the sky, run without walls around them." Alexander hesitated. The thought alone sent unease through him. For years he had kept the boys sheltered, safe from stares, from judgment, from a world he wasn't sure would understand them. "They'll be overwhelmed," he argued. "It's too much for them." But Sophia shook her head gently. "Or it could be exactly what they need." "Children don't bloom in cages, Alexander. No matter how gilded the bars." The truth in her words stung. After a long silence, he gave the faintest nod. "1 hour," he said at last, as though the limitation might shield him from the unknown. That Saturday morning, the car rolled to a stop at the edge of the city park. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. The twins pressed their faces against the windows, eyes wide at the sight of families scattered across fields, kites soaring high and dogs racing along paths. As soon as the doors opened, Caleb bolted forward, his small legs unsteady but determined. Liam followed quickly, squealing with excitement. They stumbled into the grass, falling and laughing, their hands brushing against blades of green like it was treasure. Alexander stepped out slowly, tension stiff in his shoulders, his gaze darting across the crowd. Every passerby felt like a potential threat, yet Sophia moved with ease, her eyes fixed on the boys, her smile warm as she guided them toward a quieter patch beneath the tree. There she spread a blanket, pulling snacks and small toys from her bag. The twins dove into play, building castles from sticks and leaves. When Caleb pointed at a passing kite, Sophia quickly shaped a sign for kite, repeating it until he mimicked her. Liam joined in, and soon both boys were pointing at the sky, signing excitedly with every swoop of color above them. Alexander stood nearby, torn between awe and unease. He saw how the world opened around them, how every soundless laugh, every fumbling gesture carried more meaning than words ever could. Yet he couldn't shake the fear that someone would notice, someone would judge, someone would break the fragile bubble of joy they had built. And then it happened. A group of children ran past, their chatter filling the air. One boy slowed, staring at Liam and Caleb as they flapped their arms to mimic the kite overhead. "Why are they doing that?" the child asked aloud, curiosity tinged with mockery. Alexander stiffened instantly, his fists curling. Heat rose in his chest, anger sharp and protective. He opened his mouth, ready to snap at the boy. But before he could, Sophia knelt beside the twins, her hands moving gracefully. "Different is beautiful," she signed, smiling as she exaggerated the words so the boys could follow. Then louder, she added for the other child to hear, "They're talking with their hands. It's their special language." The boy blinked surprised, then shrugged and ran after his friends. The moment passed as quickly as it came. But Alexander's heart thundered. He had seen it, the possibility of cruelty, of misunderstanding. And he had also seen how Sophia deflected it, not with anger but with dignity. She hadn't just protected the boys, she had honored them. Later, as the twins napped on the blanket, Alexander stood a few feet away, his voice low. "How did you do that?" Sophia tilted her head. "Do what?" "Take something cruel," he said, struggling for words, "and turn it into strength." Her eyes softened. "Because they'll face it again. And they'll need to know their worth before the world tries to tell them otherwise." His chest tightened. He looked at her then, really looked, and realized how much she had already given them, how much she had already given him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just imagining survival, he was imagining a future. The park outing marked a turning point. After that day, something inside Alexander began to shift in ways even he couldn't deny. The fear was still there, yes, but it no longer ruled him completely. He had seen his sons laugh under the open sky, felt the warmth of their small hands tugging him forward. He had also seen Sophia transform a cruel moment into one of quiet pride. That memory alone refused to leave him. Back at the mansion, the twins carried their newfound joy everywhere. They dragged Sophia to the windows each morning, eager to point at birds, clouds, or even the neighbor's passing dog, fumbling through new signs, as if trying to name the entire world at once. Sometimes, when they grew frustrated, Alexander knelt beside them, clumsy with his hands but determined to try. Each success, each smile that followed melted more of the ice he had carried for years. One evening, after a long day at the office, Alexander returned home to find the house unusually quiet. Panic flickered through him until he heard faint humming drifting from the garden. He stepped outside and froze. Sophia was sitting beneath the lantern-lit pergola, her back against a wooden post, with Caleb asleep in her lap and Liam curled beside her, his head resting against her shoulder. Her voice was soft, carrying an old lullaby. The sight pierced Alexander in a way he hadn't expected. For years that had been Grace's place, her song, her warmth. Seeing Sophia there, her arms encircling his children, he felt both the ache of memory and the strange, undeniable comfort of the present. She looked up when she noticed him, her expression unreadable. "They wore themselves out today," she whispered, careful not to wake the boys. He stepped closer, unsure what to say. For once his voice carried no authority, only quiet sincerity. You give them more than I ever could." Sophia shook her head gently. "You give them something too, Alexander. You give them safety. They know you'll always be here." Her words caught him off guard. Safety. It wasn't a word he had ever associated with himself. He had thought of himself as rigid, distant, even cold. But safety? That felt different. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. But it wasn't the old silence. This one was soft, almost companionable. He lowered himself onto the bench across from her, his eyes fixed on the twins, their small chests rising and falling in unison. "They used to cry for hours," he confessed quietly. "Nothing I did helped. I thought maybe they didn't need me. Maybe they knew I wasn't enough." Sophia's gaze softened and her voice carried a tenderness that cut through his defenses. "They needed you then, just as they need you now. They didn't want perfection. They just wanted their father." His throat tightened. He looked away, the weight of years pressing down on him. Yet for the first time, he didn't feel crushed by it. He felt lifted. When the twins stirred, Sophia shifted carefully, her hands gentle as she laid them on the blanket. Alexander helped, his movements awkward but sincere. Together they tucked the boys in, side by side, like parents who had done this 100 times before. Later, as they stood in the doorway watching Liam and Caleb drift back into dreams, Alexander turned to her. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "I don't say this easily, but thank you, Sophia, for them, for everything." She gave a small smile, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "You don't have to thank me. They've given me just as much." And though he didn't speak it aloud, Alexander realized something in that moment. He wasn't just grateful, he was beginning to hope again. The change in the Hayes household didn't go unnoticed outside its walls. For years, Alexander had been known as a man of precision, all steel and control, the type of father others whispered about with pity. But whispers began to shift. Colleagues remarked on the rare softness in his tone when he mentioned his sons. Staff in the mansion exchanged knowing glances when he lingered longer in the playroom, or when his laughter, unpracticed but genuine, echoed faintly down the hall. Still, Alexander himself remained wary. Hope was fragile, and he had lived too long in its shadow to trust it fully. Progress felt like a thread that could snap at any moment, but Liam and Caleb seemed determined to prove otherwise. Their signs grew clearer, their vocabulary expanding under Sophia's patient hands. Where once they had struggled with single words, now they strung 2 or 3 together, their excitement bubbling over each time they succeeded. Alexander began keeping a notebook in his pocket, jotting down every new sign he learned, practicing at night until his fingers ached. One evening, Sophia entered the library to find him hunched over the notebook, lips moving silently as he rehearsed. He didn't notice her at first, too absorbed in shaping the words. When he finally looked up embarrassed, she only smiled. "They'll love that you're trying," she said softly. "I should have done it years ago," he admitted, his voice low. "They don't care about years past," she replied. "They care about now." Her words settled in him like a balm. Not long after, an unexpected moment of triumph came. The twins were sprawled across the rug in the living room, stacking blocks into precarious towers. Caleb's tower tipped over, and for the first time, instead of frustration, he signed clearly, "Help, Papa." Alexander froze, his chest tightening. The request was simple. Liam joined in, signing "Good Papa" with a grin so wide it nearly split his face. Alexander's vision blurred. He signed back, clumsy but determined. "Proud." Both boys squealed, throwing their arms around his neck. He held them tight, the dam inside him breaking. For the first time, he felt not just like their guardian, not just like a man surviving grief. He felt like their father. Sophia stood in the doorway, watching quietly, her expression unreadable. But when Alexander finally glanced at her, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, trust, and perhaps, though neither would admit it yet, something deeper. That night, long after the boys had gone to sleep, Alexander found himself standing in front of Grace's photograph. For years he had avoided it, but now he studied it carefully. The curve of her smile, the warmth in her eyes. "I'm trying," he whispered into the quiet. "I don't know if I'm doing it right, but I'm trying." And for the first time since her passing, he didn't feel like he was speaking into emptiness. He felt as though she had heard autumn crept into the city, painting the trees around the mansion in shades of amber and gold. The air carried a crispness that seemed to mirror the quiet transformation within the Hayes family. One Saturday morning, Sophia suggested another outing, this time to a small fall festival at the edge of town. Alexander hesitated, the old fear prickling at him, but the twins' eager faces left him little choice. He agreed, though not without his usual caveat. "Just for a little while," he said firmly, as though setting boundaries could shield them from disappointment. The festival was alive with color. Stalls lined the streets, filled with pumpkins, homemade pies, and lanterns that swayed gently in the breeze. Children darted past with painted faces, their laughter mingling with the music of fiddles and drums. Liam and Caleb's eyes widened, overwhelmed but fascinated. At first they clung to Sophia, their hands gripping her coat tightly. But gradually curiosity tugged them forward. Caleb pointed toward a booth where children dipped brushes into bright paint, smearing it across paper pumpkins. Sophia guided them over, crouching low. "Want to try?" she asked gently, signing the words as well. Liam hesitated, but Caleb grabbed a brush, dipping it into red paint and splattering it wildly across the page. A squeal of delight escaped him. Liam followed, more cautious, carefully filling in small squares with blue. Alexander stood behind them, tense but watching. When Liam looked up, his little hands shaped a sign toward his father. Paint. For a moment, Alexander froze. The request was so simple, so ordinary, and yet it carried the weight of everything he had feared he would never have. Slowly he lowered himself onto the bench beside them, awkwardly taking a brush. The boys erupted into giggles, smearing paint across the paper, some of it landing on Alexander's sleeve. For once he didn't care. They moved from booth to booth, trying games, tasting pies, even riding the carousel. Alexander held them tightly, his arms encircling their small bodies as the painted horses lifted and fell. Their laughter rang against his chest, filling cracks he hadn't realized were still there. But then came another test. At a puppet show near the festival center, a group of children gathered, clapping and singing along. Liam and Caleb sat cross-legged in the front, their faces alight. When the crowd shouted responses to the puppeteer's questions, the twins joined in, silent, using their hands. A few children noticed, whispered, laughed. Alexander's entire body tensed. The old instinct surged. Pull them away, shield them, retreat into silence. But before he could move, Sophia leaned down to the twins and signed with deliberate clarity, "You are perfect." The boys grinned, repeating the sign back. The whispers faded into the background. Alexander's throat ached. He watched, realizing that in moments like this, she wasn't just guiding the boys, she was teaching him that strength wasn't about hiding from the world. It was about meeting it, even when it stared. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Alexander and Sophia lingered in the kitchen, the faint scent of autumn pies still clinging to the air. He leaned against the counter, his voice low, almost uncertain. "They're stronger than I ever imagined," he admitted. Sophia looked at him, her gaze steady. They always were. They just needed someone to believe it. For a long moment he held her eyes. Something unspoken hummed between them, something fragile but undeniable. And for the first time, Alexander didn't turn away. Winter came early that year, blanketing the mansion grounds in soft layers of snow. The twins pressed their faces to the frosted windows each morning, mesmerized by the shimmering white outside. It didn't take long before they begged through excited signs and tugging hands to go out and play. Alexander hesitated at first. The snow seemed another unknown, another opportunity for things to go wrong. But Sophia's gentle encouragement tipped the scale. Soon the four of them were bundled in coats, scarves, and gloves, stepping out into a world transformed. The boys squealed as their boots crunched across the untouched snow. Caleb immediately bent down, scooping a clumsy handful and tossing it into the air, watching the flakes scatter. Liam followed, his laugh bubbling out in the cold air. Sophia knelt with them, shaping snowballs, showing them how to press the powder into firm little spheres. The twins copied eagerly, their faces red with cold but glowing with joy. From a few feet away, Alexander watched, arms crossed against the chill. He couldn't remember the last time he had been in snow for anything other than rushing to a car. Yet watching them now, something inside him stirred. The soundless laughter, the sheer delight it pulled at him. When Caleb launched a snowball that smacked against Sophia's coat, she laughed and pointed dramatically at Alexander. Both boys turned, their eyes gleaming with mischief. Together they scrambled to form more snowballs. Alexander raised his hands in mock defense. Oh no, too late. The first snowball hit his chest, then another. The boys squealed, stomping their feet in victory. "Traitors," Alexander muttered, scooping snow into his own hands. His fingers, stiff with cold, shaped a large, lopsided ball. He lobbed it gently toward Caleb, who dodged with a triumphant squeak. Liam tried to retaliate, his snowball crumbling before it left his hands. What followed was chaos, pure, unrestrained chaos. Snowballs flying in every direction, laughter echoing across the empty grounds. For the first time, the mansion's gardens, once silent under grief, rang with joy. At one point, Liam slipped, tumbling into a pile of snow. Alexander rushed forward, heart in his throat, but Liam only laughed, flapping his arms to make an angel in the powder. Caleb joined him, their bodies carving twin shapes into the white. Sophia watched, her cheeks flushed, her eyes alight with something that warmed Alexander more than the scarf around his neck. As the game slowed, the twins collapsed in the snow, breathless and giggling. Alexander crouched beside them, brushing frost from their coats. "You win," he signed clumsily, his grin unguarded. The boys clapped in triumph. Later, back inside with cocoa steaming on the table, Alexander caught Sophia's gaze across the mugs. His voice was quiet but steady. "You've given them back their childhood." Her expression softened. "No, Alexander, you did. You just needed someone to remind you how?" He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight flickering between them. And though he didn't say it aloud, he knew she was right. The holiday season arrived, bringing with it traditions Alexander hadn't touched since Grace's passing. For years, December had been another month to survive, stripped of decorations, stripped of joy. But this year was different. It began with Sophia bringing home a small box of ornaments. "Just a few," she said, her tone careful. "We don't have to do much. But maybe the boys would like a tree." Alexander almost refused out of habit, the old grief rising in him. But when Liam's small hands reached into the box and lifted a glittering star, his eyes wide with wonder, Alexander's resistance faltered. 2 days later, a tree stood in the mansion's grand hall. Not the towering, flawless kind decorators once assembled for parties, but a simple evergreen chosen at the local market. The twins circled it in awe, their fingers brushing its needles, their faces glowing. Sophia guided them through the process, hanging ornaments, stringing lights, even draping popcorn chains the boys had clumsily helped create. Caleb placed a crooked paper angel he had made with Sophia at the very center, laughing when it tipped sideways. Alexander stood back at first, watching. His chest ached with memory. Grace had loved this season. She would hum carols as she hung ornaments, teasing him for being too serious as she draped tinsel around his shoulders. The ache sharpened until he almost retreated. But then Liam turned, holding out a small ornament with both hands. His little fingers shaped a sign. "Papa, help." The words rooted Alexander to the spot. Slowly he crossed the room, kneeling to let Liam press the ornament into his palm. Together they hung it on the lowest branch. Caleb cheered, clapping wildly. Something inside Alexander cracked open. He stayed, helping them hang each piece, his large hands fumbling but determined. When the final ornament was placed, the boys demanded the lights be turned on. Sophia plugged them in, and the tree burst into color. Liam and Caleb gasped, their faces illuminated by the glow. Alexander swallowed hard, blinking back tears. The grand hall, once cold and lifeless, now pulsed with warmth. That evening, as they sipped cocoa beneath the tree, Sophia began humming softly. Without thinking, Alexander recognized the tune. It was the same lullaby Grace had once sung. His throat constricted, but instead of pain, he felt something else. Healing. The twins nestled against him, their small bodies warm. Sophia sat nearby, her presence steady, her eyes reflecting the glow of the lights. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the season not as a wound, but as a gift. When the boys finally drifted to sleep, he lingered by the tree with Sophia. The silence between them carried no weight, only peace. "Grace would have loved this," he said quietly. Sophia met his gaze, her voice gentle. "She'd be proud of you." His chest tightened, but this time he didn't look away. Snow continued to fall, covering the estate grounds in a thick, glittering blanket. The mansion, once known for its sterile silence, now pulsed with warmth. Each day seemed to weave new threads of connection, threads Alexander hadn't believed possible only months ago. The twins thrived. Their vocabulary and sign language blossomed, expanding faster than Alexander could keep up. He practiced late at night, his large hands clumsy, but his determination fierce. Sometimes when he signed a word correctly, Liam would giggle and clap, and Caleb would tug him forward proudly to show Sophia. Each success, no matter how small, felt monumental. One evening, while the fire crackled in the hearth, Sophia brought out a simple wooden box. She set it on the rug where the twins played, her eyes flicking to Alexander as if asking silent permission. "What's this?" he asked, curious. "A memory box," she explained. "I thought maybe it's time to let them know more about Grace. Not just through pictures, but through things she touched, stories she left behind." Alexander froze, his chest tightening. For years, he had locked Grace's belongings away, convinced that keeping them out of sight would protect the boys from grief. But looking at Sophia, at the twins who now stared at the box with wide eyes, he realized the opposite might be true. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside were small, ordinary treasures. Grace's favorite scarf, a worn paperback with notes scribbled in the margins, a locket with a tiny photograph inside. Liam reached for the scarf, running it across his cheek, his eyes soft. Caleb tugged at the locket, fascinated by the miniature picture inside. Alexander swallowed hard, his voice rough as he began to explain. This was hers. She loved reading before bed. She wore this scarf every winter. His words faltered, but Sophia's gentle nod urged him on. She loved you from the moment she knew you were coming. The boys listened, their hands touching each item reverently. Though they couldn't hear his voice, they felt the weight of his words through his signs, through the emotion that trembled in his chest. Sophia added softly, "She's still part of your story, always will be." That night, after the boys were asleep, Alexander lingered by the box, staring at the locket in his palm. His voice, quiet but certain, broke the silence. "I've been running from her memory for years, but maybe keeping her alive in them is the way forward." Sophia's eyes glistened. She reached out, resting her hand gently over his. "That's not running, Alexander. That's love finding its way back." For a long moment he said nothing, but the weight in his chest eased. The mansion, once a tomb of silence, was becoming a living home again. And deep inside, Alexander knew this was only the beginning. The new year arrived quietly, snow still draped across the grounds. But inside the Hayes mansion, everything felt transformed. Where once grief had been the only rhythm, now there was laughter, routine, and the steady pulse of family life. The twins no longer drifted through the halls like shadows. They filled each day with exploration, scribbling pictures at the kitchen table, chasing each other across the garden paths, tugging Alexander into games he never imagined himself playing. Their signs grew quicker, sharper, until conversations flowed with ease. And Alexander, once a man defined by loss, found himself changed too. He had learned to kneel, to listen, to laugh. He had learned that fatherhood wasn't about perfection but presence. Each bedtime story he signed, each awkward but earnest step he attempted, stitched another piece of healing into the life he shared with his sons. Sophia's presence wove through it all like quiet light. She remained steady, guiding, teaching, lifting the boys higher than Alexander had ever believed possible. But she had also touched him, not through grand gestures, but through the simplest truths. That grief could coexist with love, that silence could be filled with meaning, and that broken things could be made whole again. One evening, as the fire flickered in the hearth, Liam and Caleb climbed into Alexander's lap, their small hands busy shaping signs. "Happy family," they declared with wide grins. Alexander's throat tightened, his hands trembling as he signed back. "Yes, happy family." When the boys finally drifted into sleep, their heads resting against his chest, Alexander looked across the room at Sophia. She sat quietly watching, her expression soft. For a long moment neither spoke. Then, in a voice that carried both gratitude and something deeper, Alexander broke the silence. "I thought my life ended with Grace. I thought my sons would never know joy. But you," he faltered, searching for words, "you gave us back more than I can ever repay." Sophia shook her head gently. "I didn't give it back, Alexander. It was always there. You just needed someone to remind you how to see it." Their eyes held, the firelight painting warmth across the space between them. In that moment, Alexander understood what he had resisted for so long. That hope was not fragile but resilient. That love, once thought buried, had a way of returning in forms he had never expected. The mansion, once drowned in silence, now breathed with laughter and life. And though the scars of the past would always remain, they no longer defined the future. Liam stirred in his sleep, his small hands curling against Alexander's chest. Caleb shifted closer, murmuring softly. Alexander kissed their foreheads, his heart full. For the first time in years, he wasn't haunted by what he had lost. He was grateful for what he still had and for what was still to come. And as he looked at Sophia, steady and luminous in the firelight, Alexander Hayes knew one truth above all: they were no longer broken. They were a family.